Welcome, everybody. We're just giving it just a second for folks to transition in from the waiting room, and then we will get started. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. My name is Meg Fromm, and I'm the education manager for NAMELY, the National Association for Media Literacy Education. And I'm so excited to have this panel today. We have some incredible artists and scholars and writers. This is a panel conversation with composer and performer Molly Joyce, artist Kyah Probst, and media literacy expert Elizaveta Friesem. And we're going to talk about media and how making media such as art, music, and other forms of self-expression can really support inclusion and identity making for those with disabilities. And so we're going to have a great conversation, but first we're going to let artists Kyah and Molly give some overview of their work, introduce themselves, talk about their experiences, and then Elizaveta will bring in some media literacy perspective and talk a little bit about what she's found through her work. So if you're just joining us, again, we're so happy that you are here for this conversation on how art and media literacy can reshape notions of disability and representation. So I want to first introduce Molly Joyce, who is a composer and performer, and she's going to share a little bit more about her work and talk to you about a recent project that is launching just this month, right, Molly? I think October 28th is your official launch. Yeah, okay, awesome, beautiful. So I'm going to go ahead and let Molly tell you a little bit more about herself. I think it's better when people get to share in their own words, and she's going to share her work and tell you about her new launch of her installment, Perspective.
Thank you so much, Meg. And of course, want to say how honored and grateful I am to be with you all today. It's really, again, just such an honor to be among such amazing panelists. I'm excited to share more about my work as well. So with that, I'll start my screen share. And I do apologize, there's some lawn movement going on around my apartment, but hopefully will not interfere too much. And fix the Zoom. And before I dive in more into sharing the project, Meg mentioned that's kind of being released, if you will, as an album this Friday. I wanted to start with some accessibility I like to practice with any talks, especially as a disabled artist, committed to disability values of inclusivity and accessibility. So first I'll provide a visual description of myself. I'm a white, light-skinned female with blue eyes and kind of brown and blonde hair. Today my hair is tied up in a ponytail. I'm wearing a brown t-shirt and I'm in a room with light brown walls behind me. And before I dive into the project a little more, I just want to kind of share a teaser from it and also share a sound description for it. So in this track titled Weakness, a high organ drone begins with a singing female voice gradually entering, meandering throughout and searching for grounding. What is weakness for you?
Weakness, gosh, that's so loaded. Yeah, it's not a word I think about that much, and I wonder why.
I think weakness is one of those words that I have trouble defining insofar as it is often defined for me, and actually most people find weakness is defined for them by somebody outside, and that ends up becoming internalized.
Some disabled people are weak some of the time, but so is everybody else.
I can find it hard to admit when I'm feeling weak. The openness there is also an openness to potential hurt.
The default way of being and existing in the world.
And on the slide, I have black text against the white background, which I'll read out. And on the right-hand side is an image of myself at 8 years old, sitting in a brown wooden chair with a splint on my scarred left hand/arm, which is attached to a cello bow. I'm holding a brown cello between my legs with my right hand on the cello fingerboard. So just to share a little bit about my background and really how I came to this project, especially very interview-based and highlighting stories of disabled individuals. I myself identify as disabled. About 20 years ago, I was involved in a car accident that nearly amputated my left hand. And since the accident, it's definitely been a journey from denying my disability to embracing it first and foremost. And I think that journey has largely kind of paralleled the expansion of my artistic practice from one very much focused on competition to involving performance, collaboration, and of course, kind of more community engagement, as in with this project. And on this slide, I have black text against a white background, which I'll read out. And on the right-hand side is an image of Judith Heumann and myself smiling at the camera. Heumann is in a motorized wheelchair with a pink and purple zipper jacket and black pants, and I am in a black coat with gray leggings. So this project started in a dialogue with the legendary disability activist Judith Heumann. I highly recommend her work. She had a memoir come out about 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago now. I highly recommend. It's very easy read. And she's also featured prominently in the Netflix film Crip Camp. And Judy she's such an amazing mentor to so many people. I feel like she always knows the right question to ask at the right time. And in one of my conversations with her, she asked why I referred to my left hand as weak. And this question really struck me kind of personally and almost politically, if you will, as I knew that I always kind of reiterated these flawed notions of what weakness can and should be, especially if someone asked what happened to my hand or I had to explain why I couldn't do something. I would usually just say, oh, I have a weaker left side, just to kind of, get it out of the room, get it out of the conversation as quickly as possible. So that really set this project in motion, which I wanted to ask what weaknesses to individuals across a range of disabilities and expanding to further questions related to that. So on the slide, I have black text against a white background, which I'll read out. And on the left-hand side, I have questions asked with the original iteration of the project, which began a few years ago in Washington, D.C., including questions like, what is access for you? What is care for you? What is control, weakness, strength, cure, interdependence, and assumption? And then on the right-hand side, I have questions that were asked more recently with a kind of winter iteration of the project, which was done in conjunction with the festival there. So questions related to winter, such as what is resilience for you? What is isolation, connection, and darkness? And with that, I've been fortunate, on the slide, I have black text against the white background, which I'll read out. And with these questions, I've been very fortunate to interview 47 disabled individuals so far. And with these individuals, I was always striving to get a variety of disabilities and backgrounds as possible. So their disabilities range from physical, intellectual, vision to hearing impairments, with backgrounds ranging from veterans, entrepreneurs, academics, activists, artists, and even pageant models. One of the interviewees from the first iteration, Nicole Kelly, was former Miss Iowa. And then on the bottom of the slide here, I have the names for all the interviewees that have participated so far, including in that original iteration done in DC, expanding to the Minnesota one, and then finally to one in Idaho done last year with a disabled dance company there. And with that, I wanted to share the last video from the project, or one more video selection, this time a fuller selection from it. And this is for the section titled Resilience. And in this section, pulsing chords relentlessly push forward, eventually leading to an opening bass note, while high vocals oscillate above them. What is resilience for you?
Come back.
Adapting your response to the world in a way that assumes that the best is possible.
Understanding what you can do to move forward. You might not be able to change what has happened, but what can you do to move forward to keep going?
Is that I will be able to get up and start over again as many times as I need to. It's a never give in feeling.
As a crucial component of the truths that the body already has mastered, that the mind has to learn from.
When it comes to people that are disabled, they know their body and they know their mind more than anybody else does. So when other people tell you that you can't do that, it gets really frustrating.
Self-advocacy, I think, is sort of the spawn or the sprout of my resilience. The sort of interactions and experience I have with other people telling me I can't do what I want, and the sort of thing where there's accessibility boundaries to keep me from creating the art that I want or the life that I want to live or whatever. There's absolutely no way that any of this sort of stuff is going to stop me. Whether it's, navigating in the weather, going out and dealing with people in public that don't think I should be there, people that consider it an inspiration that I actually managed to go to the store to buy a Snickers bar.
Being able to maybe not outlast, but last has to do with existence. I think to exist is resilience in a lot of ways.
It means interdependence. It means intersectionality. It means you're not alone. It means your story, once it's told and shared with other people, can be someone else's survival guide.
Having relationships that go beyond transactional, I think, gives me the resources and the sense of I can do, or it can be done, which makes me really resilient.
Going above and beyond what you do.
It's very hard to ignore what makes you lopsided in my case. To ignore that pain and to ignore the way people sometimes look at you and just push past it. So even the word has a particular weight that is damaging because it just suggests that you have to be resilient.
Resilience assumes there was a before and then an after, that there is a good thing to return to, that you emerge stronger, that there are no negative consequences from a simple misfortune or trauma, and thus you are deemed a failure at resilience because you cannot manage any of the supposedly healthy ways of bouncing back from trauma. But maybe it isn't you who is a failure. Maybe it is the conception of resilience. Thank you.
Awesome, Molly. Full disclosure, I followed Molly's work for a really long time. She is basically family to me. In fact, I think that photo of you playing the cello, I think that was at my house. I think I saw that. I was like, that's my childhood dog. So this is one of my favorite projects that you've ever done. I just dropped the link into the chat for folks to check it out. You've done a lot of iterations with this, and I know you've gotten a lot of feedback, as artists always do. And so I'm wondering, how your feelings about the project or even your approach to it has changed through those iterations or through the feedback that you've gotten. I wonder if you could speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. It's been interesting to think about. I don't know, I guess from the start, to be honest, I think I've tried to really stay true to the project values of those interview questions, like recording their answers, staying true to that, honoring them with the open caption videos as well, really stressing that as like the sole visual of the project in order to really underscore like accessibility of it for multiple sensory outputs, especially with disability culture. It's definitely been interesting as I've moved into this phase with the album and trying to promote it and, get write-ups and so forth that I think like I've had some writers say like, oh, I only review music, like this has spoken voice, so it's not music, or which I don't think they're trying to be super negative, but that's just something I didn't think would come up. And that's probably maybe some question for the larger like iteration too, like what really is media too, or some people think it's too multimedia project or it's an installation, because it is very kind of fluid. And I think for me, that's been an interesting, just like challenge and opportunity as well too, especially with disability aesthetics. I feel like so much again is trying to go through these like interdisciplinary or multi-sensory projects to not place primacy on one, ability or sensory value. And then it's an interesting challenge when you're trying to get your project out there, but there's clearly music publications or art publications. It's kind of like, what category does it fit into? Mm-hmm.
That is so interesting. And, that definitely would be something we can talk with, bring Elizaveta into the conversation in a little bit. That notion of what art is, and is all art media, and is all media art, and especially when it comes to self-expression. So thank you for sharing. I want to transition over to Kyah so she can share a little bit about her work as well. And I dropped the ball on sharing my screen properly, to give every artist their due. So I did want to, as we transition over to Kyah, she wanted to share this quote, which is really inspired, I think, some of her work and her approach to her work. So I will turn it over to her so she can share what she has done.
Thank you so much, Meg. I guess I'll start by introducing myself. I am Kyah Probst. I am a graphic mixed media artist based here in Wisconsin. I'm also an author and a writer and a lot of other things, but I'm specifically talking about my visual art here today. And bear with me here, I guess, for a second. I'm gonna start with a really, really early memory, but I promise I won't go through my whole life story for you. Back when I was really, really young, 2, 3, around that age, I would do these these little patterns and designs and stuff. And I would draw them in more swirls and dots and lines and things like that. And through the years, that sort of kind of pattern making definitely developed into my current art style, which is it's very much so process art. But a lot of times I start with a mixed media, sort of painting or drawing, and I do watercolor, ink, acrylic, all of that stuff. And then I will scan them both. I'll make 2 of them, scan them both, and layer them on top of each other and make that top layer semi-transparent so that they sort of one of them shines a little bit. And but the thing is that over the years, I started to realize, looking back on those really early memories of there is definitely a sensory self-soothing involved in that, and that is because I am autistic. And when people think of autism, a very big stereotype is this idea of stimming, and that's I do it all the time. I rock back and forth, or I'm moving my body in a certain way. And something that I thought is pertinent to that is that artwork for me, and this is an idea that I elaborate on, is definitely a form of stimming. Also, Meg, I thought I would mention that I can't see the screen anymore. Are you still sharing your screen?
Oh, I can. I wanted them to see your lovely face. But yes, let me reshare that.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry so much. But yeah, and so it kind of goes back to this idea of, thank you so much, Meg, of stimming. And that is that it's pattern making, and so is the art that I create. And so in this article called The Art of Stimming, David Perry says, to the casual observer, my son's stimming seems to consist of a simple up and down motion, but slowed down, one can observe the elegant intricacies of his pattern making. And then he goes on to explain, he's subtly flicking his wrist and shifting his grip, and there's a 90-degree angle involved, and that's very much so the way that I stim. But most importantly, what's in this quote is Julia Bascom, the director of Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, says that stimming is a way that we can help ourselves feel calm or soothed or focused, but it can also be a huge source of joy and beauty. And when I think of, how my artwork is very much so this visual stim, it's, and I mean that in both a visual and kinesthetic way, that's really how I think about art, right? It's pattern making, it's joy, and it's beauty. And so I'm gonna share my screen here really quick. And I'm gonna show you a little bit about, give you a visual example of kind of what I mean when I say those things. I might be having another issue here. Okay, Meg, can I ask you to do something really quick?
Absolutely.
Would you be able to bring that screen up again? And if you click on my name, it's linked to the screen that I want to share.
Excellent. Absolutely. I'm happy. I'm happy to be the Vanna White to all of the awesome people here today.
And I guess I changed my system preferences before this, but I guess it is wrong again. So that'll be the third time this week that that's happened to me.
The best laid plans. Absolutely.
I know. So if you click on Pareidolia collection, that is where I'll basically be sharing my work. But anyway, these are kind of an example of what I mean. And there's a broader implication of this, and that is that as a person, I very much so, and people have said this to me before, at least, I repudiate people's expectations of what an autistic person acts like and sounds like. And this artwork is kind of playing on the same idea. When you go in there and you're looking at these paintings, you might not even understand necessarily what I'm saying by this is an extension of my stimming, and this is an extension of a lot of my symptoms of as an autistic person. But it's really all about going in there and seeing the patterns and finding meaning. And that is the overarching scale of this larger project. And yeah, that's basically just what I wanted to share. And again, thank you so much to Molly for presenting. Your project is absolutely wonderful and amazing. And I look forward to having a conversation with you later.
Thank you so much, Kyah. And I'm going to also put the link for your work in the chat here so folks can explore as we continue to talk about this. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about just the process of, I hear a lot from artists and in having friends and family experiencing their journey with disability about sort of coming to terms or learning to embrace just everything you have to offer.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of learning to embrace these intersections that you talked about.
That is an amazing question. Let me tell you. So, and this is really what I would love to say. If I could get the entire world in front of me to say this, I totally would. And that's that it wasn't until my junior year of college that I started to look at my artwork and say two things. Wait a second, being autistic has everything to do with what I create. It's visual stimming, it's hyperfixation, it's all of these things. But I don't talk about it. I don't talk about it because my entire life, I feel like, when you're an autistic person, you grow up hearing things like, we have to find a cure. And in media, you hear all of these stories about how autistic people are inconveniencing the people around them, or they're not fitting into the molds that are expected of them. And for me, I took a step back and I said to myself, wait a second, I actually like being autistic. And I know, how dare I? But you never hear that perspective ever. And so really, when I was doing my artwork and coming to these realizations of being autistic has everything to do with what I create. It's just my brain. It's just the way that it's shaped. And why don't I talk about it more? Why is this a perspective that I'm worried about sharing with people? And so it all comes down to this idea that like disability and art are similar, and that they can be wonderful and beautiful and also just not what you expect at all. And that's really the point. That's the point of what I create and why I share what I share.
I love that idea of it not being what you expect. That really stands out to me. And I am also thinking back to Molly's work and one of the quotes of, to exist is resilience. And I think a lot about in this conversation, I think an interesting media literacy perspective is thinking about those expectations. Like, what do we expect of people? What do we expect of artists? What do we expect in representation, and how they represent themselves or are represented by other people? So I think this is a great chance to bring on our media literacy expert, scholar, and writer, Elizaveta Friesem. And before I slack again, oh my goodness, on sharing my screen here with her awesome work. I pulled a quote from her article, which I'm going to link in the chat for folks as we get to know her work. But Elizaveta is a media literacy expert, a scholar, a writer, just a lot of wonderful varied interests. And I pulled this quote from her article that she'll speak a little bit to, from 2020. And the article is about teaching. It's called Teaching About Intersections of Disability, Gender, and Sexuality Through Media Literacy Education. And I thought these two lines really summed up some of the connections that I would love for us to talk about. This idea that it is essential to make sure not only that disability is visible, but also that the role of its constructed nature in power imbalances is properly understood. Media literacy education, thus, can be used to ensure that problematic ideologies of disability are not endlessly reproduced through the media. And those two lines really just hit me like every time that I looked at your work and thinking about this. So Elizaveta, I would love for you to share a little bit more about the article, about sort of your expertise around media representations, and then we can broaden out the conversation.
Sure. Thank you so much, Meg, for introducing me, and of course for inviting me to be on this panel. All right. First of all, I need to clarify a couple of things. First of all, I want to say that I do not have a disability, right? So, so I want to be very careful when I'm talking about people with disabilities representing themselves. So if I say something wrong, please do correct me. And that's one thing. And the other thing is that I did not write this article all by myself. It was a co-authored article with Kyah Probst. And I really enjoyed working with you, Donnell. I'm sure you're somewhere there listening. So I wanted to say that I loved hearing now about the projects of our two other guests, Molly and Kyah. And regarding Molly's art, I love this really deeply moving combination of voices and music. And I think for me, it highlighted the importance of giving people a voice and letting them talk about their experiences. And as for Kyah's art, I love this idea about self-soothing pattern making, and of course, the importance of embracing yourself and loving yourself and showing people how what they consider a weakness can be and is actually a strength, right? And it is a source of beauty. So I love that perspective. So again, I'm a part of this panel not as a person with disability, but as a media literacy education expert. So I will talk from this perspective solely. In media literacy, it's really important to talk about who creates messages, like who talks about whom, like who defines other people, or are people allowed to define themselves and talk about themselves? And what happens when we can actually speak for ourselves? And in this sense, it doesn't matter what kind of background we have. It can be people with disabilities, or people of different races or genders or sexualities, ages, religions, places of origin, so many other things. Like, how do we make sure that voices are heard and listened to? So this is, of course, a lot about power, which I believe is mentioned in that quote that Meg pulled out of my article, right? So understanding power relations through media literacy education is essential, right? So this is what we discussed in the article with Donnell, right? Who when it comes to representing people with disabilities, who speaks? Do they speak for themselves, or somebody else speaks for them? And one interesting thing that came up is that for those here who are very familiar with media literacy education, if you practice media, critical media analysis, you probably notice that it's fairly easy to analyze messages that we're already kind of suspicious a little bit about. Like, if you take a media personalities that a media personality, for example, that you don't like too much, or like a channel, a media outlet that is maybe on the other side, quote unquote, of where you position yourself, then it's easy to pick apart what this person or media outlet say. But when it's something that touches us, that we connect with deeply, then it becomes really difficult to analyze this kind of message. But in media literacy education, you're supposed to be able to analyze that as well. And then with Donnell, we analyzed this, a video that was meant to challenge perceptions of beauty as related to disability. So when and I think the idea to write this article came to us when we talked about this video at a conference. Actually, I think it was NAMLY, right, in Philadelphia. And some people were like deeply touched, but we were thinking, well, wait a second, there are issues with this, with those representations, right? So with media literacy education, it's really difficult to critically analyze messages that we are very emotional about, right? So that's one thing. That's one of the many things that we talked about in the article. But in any case, going back to the general idea of representations and how we use media literacy, media literacy education to understand representations and power issues that come with that. So there are some things that I would like to say. It's and it goes really beyond like what we maybe traditionally see as media literacy education. It's important to listen to people and learn from them, right? Because everybody has their own unique experiences. And I heard that once from a friend he was telling me about teaching a room of people, and he told them that they're like a bunch of planets, basically, right? He was teaching this class to a bunch of planets, trying to connect them, right? You can think about the Little Prince kind of image, right? People living on little planets, but really we're all kind of like planets in a way, right? And we're often really surprised when we really listen to each other to hear other people's perspective. That's how different we are. And unfortunately, some people's perspectives, get heard or listened to, much less than other people's perspectives. So that's what media literacy education helps us highlight, right? Like, for example, I love, like, in Molly's project, when she asked people, what is weakness or what is resilience? And I thought, how often do we really ask ourselves these questions? And we can learn from people who are different from us, and we can learn from ourselves when we ask ourselves questions like that. So this also, I think, allows us to think about this balance of looking for things in common rather than differences, right? Because again, I don't have a disability, but I surely have weaknesses. So asking myself, like, what is a weakness or what is a resilience, like, that helps me. So I'm learning from voices of people with disabilities, right? So I'm looking for things in common without generalizing, because of course it's important to understand that my perspective, my experiences are very different from experiences of Molly or Kyah's in this particular instance, right? So it's important to be empathic or empathetic without being presumptuous about empathy, without saying, well, I understand you, like, because I had a kind of a similar experience. Well, it's important to show connection, to establish this connection, but it's also important to say, well, your experiences are unique, and although I strive to understand you, I strive to connect to you, I cannot fully see the world from your perspective, and that's why it's so important to hear you. Right. So yeah. So I mean, there are a lot of things that can be said. So I think I'll stop here.
No, you brought up so much, Elizaveta. Thank you. I think, oh my gosh, the idea of empathy, the idea of trying to connect and relate, but also bringing up issues of language, of power imbalances and things like that. So I'd love to target some more questions across our participants here. And certainly, if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. We absolutely can bring everybody to the table here. I was thinking early on about sort of the framework you provided, Elizaveta, about media literacy and power and language. And so to start, maybe we'll go to Molly. I'm going off script here from our questions, so sorry, Molly. But I'm thinking about all of the different ways that your interviewees responded to these questions. And so I'm wondering if there were any particular points where there was a lot of, I don't want to say discrepancy, but a lot of just different conceptualizations that maybe you didn't expect, or that just were, sort of, perhaps a lack of consensus in ways that helped you better understand both your project and the questions. I'd be curious, when you talk about language and ask these questions, how much similarity or dissonance there might have been.
Yeah, definitely. I think, to start with all the questions, I definitely told the interviewees, like, feel free to not answer or answer, or I have some kind of controversial questions, and, there's no right or wrong answers. Your answers can be as long or short as you want. And especially, I think, really key concepts like cure or interdependence, especially cure, I would say. I'd always like to say, oh, this is my controversial question, feel free to not answer, but that's where I got the most interesting answers and divergent answers. Like some say, yeah, like cure is hope. I'd love a cure. Like, I'm not going to deny that. And then I won't say I anticipated it, but from my kind of experience of disability studies, and a lot don't like cure, and some recognize cure, especially for those with like chronic illness. Like, it would be nice or something to have some like cure, but I don't want to disregard my disability identity. So I think that was the most kind of interesting responses, in a way, divergent in a way.
That's so interesting. Yeah, that I remember watching some snippets of that idea of cure. And I don't even know, just the bravery in trying to answer that question, I think is, like, just seeing, and you can hear it in their voices of just kind of grappling with that. Did you have any, just like a quick follow-up, did you have any folks that you interviewed who kind of wanted to like reframe their answer after they'd already given it, or kind of came back to you and like, oh, I wish I had said this or that? Was that part of the experience?
I'm trying to think, not really that I know of. I guess like maybe I should have done this, but I kind of just took the interviews and then kind of started editing them and then would make the music and share it with them a little later. But I have put on my website all the unedited interviews and transcripts just to have that available, because of course I edited them down subjectively. But I think, yeah, not that I know of. Maybe I should.
Okay.
But,
yeah, they're such vulnerable questions. And I think,
yeah,
sometimes, and I love that. I mean, that's what makes this be so impactful. And so even just thinking about my work as a journalist, people always would answer, and then you'd be like, no, I wish I had said this. Awesome. Well, I want to go back to Kyah's work and sort of what you shared. And I thought I was really moved by when you said, I like having autism. Like I like being a person who is autistic and that experience. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how, or if you feel like your art tries to communicate that, if you feel like that's something in an experience that you have that you try to like have seen in your work as an artist. So I was just hoping you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, and I think this goes back to like, the question earlier about embracing like having a disability, and I think I actually was talking to you guys right before this meeting. I was like, yeah, I haven't talked verbally and to an audience in a really long time about my artwork, and the reality is that the way that I talk about my artwork and the information that people have access to on a public forum about my artwork has changed based on how much I have come to embrace like what the meaning of why I do my artwork and how it connects to my disability. And I know you were talking Molly about like cures and like would I have a cure, would I not have a cure, and that is something you hear a lot growing up as an autistic person, of like, oh, I really need we need to have this cure because it's so bad or so awful or something like that. And really, and like two things to say about that, I guess, is just kind of jumping off, is just that for me, I feel like, because autism is a neurotype in a lot of ways, like if you wanted to cure my autism, you would just change everything about me. You would almost have to like kill me or something. I don't know. For me, at least, there's like a part of me that is like, no, like the thing about it's not hard just having autism. It's other people that often make it really hard. And, a lot of people would get upset when people with disabilities say those kinds of things. But for a lot of different people, it is actually, in fact, true. It's not, for me, objectively hard being autistic or trying to funnel that into my work. It's the way that I can be perceived and the way that I'm, again, represented. And so, yeah, to answer your question, it's mostly just about how I talk about myself as an artist and the way that I connect with other people. That has changed over the years, and that how that funnels into my artwork.
That idea of like language and how we talk about that just keeps coming back sort of top of mind through all of this. And I think, Elizaveta, I would be curious, just, in your work in media literacy, and you're a writer too, and in other things that you've done in your life, maybe you could talk a little bit about how the field of media literacy is evolving in our understanding of language when we talk about this. And so, for example, when I first started in media literacy many years ago, this was in the early 2000s, it was still acceptable for people to use words like handicap. And this, we've updated our language to like understand these things. And so I'm wondering what other updates with language or updates in thinking about media literacy and thinking about how we talk about and represent people through our work as researchers, like what are some lessons learned or what are some perspectives you might have with that? That's a broad question. Sorry, Elizaveta.
Oh, no, that's a great question. Thank you so much, Meg. First, I just wanted to quickly reflect on what Molly and Kyah said. Both of you talked about this controversial concept of cure. And I think it's really, really interesting and important. And like important to understand for people who don't have disabilities, right? That it's not like everything that a person with disability wants is a cure, right? That's so wrong to imagine that. And I like how Kyah talked about that. It's not, having autism is not difficult. It's like difficult to deal with, like live in the world that is not like necessarily set up for people with autism. And I think that's one of the things that I realized that I was working on the article with Donnell, that one of the sources that we used, I think it was like Garland Thompson's book, that she talks about disability as a construct, in the sense that, like why is it, might be challenging for people with a disability, for a person with disability, like to live their life. It's not necessarily the disability itself, it's because the world around them is set up like for like quote unquote normal people, right? Which is like which is very sad, right? So, and it's now we know that when we go beyond that, we actually help not only people with disabilities, we help so many other people, like universal design for learning, right? They did universal design for learning. Like we don't think of like, oh, we need to include those other people. We think like, how do we include everybody, right? So, like there are some really interesting changes happening. I think that is one thing like that is reflected in media literacy education. And speaking about language specifically, I can tell you an interesting story is that when we I don't think that I really talked to Donnell properly about this, so maybe she will be surprised to hear that. But basically, when we were writing the article, so I was thinking like how to talk about people with disabilities, and I have this friend who has disability. She had polio when she was a kid, so she when we were talking at some point, she used this term differently abled or something like that, and I was like, I thought, well, that's an interesting term, and I used it in the article, right? And I thought, well, I got it from the person with a disability. And then at some point, I got an email from somebody in Australia, I think of all places, who wrote to me, who read this article and said it was really interesting, but she also said that this is not the best term, right? So I went back and forth. It was like kind of like testing my empathy, because part of me honestly was like, oh my God, like I need now to go and change this article. Like, is it really valid? Like I did some research trying to understand, like, is it just her perspective? And, and language is changing all the time. So I know at this point, as I found out, it's better to say people with disabilities and, a person with autism, a person with visual impairment, rather than like blind person or autistic person, right? And differently able sounded like, based on my research, is not the best word after all, based on what the disabled community, which is, I think, is the term that is used, disabled community, prefers. So I, contacted the journal, and I said, I want to send you a new version of the article. And I switched it. I deleted this differently able, like I had it a few times throughout the paper, and I put people with disabilities instead. Right. So yeah, language is changing, and it's tricky because something that we use like a few years ago suddenly becomes less acceptable. But I think it's important to listen to, again, about voices, right? Listen to people with disabilities in this case.
Right. And I think that brings up a good, you talked about empathy, and then also, so we want, especially I think regardless of what it is, to have media that helps us connect with people. Can be connecting over cooking, right? I mean, the topic in some ways, doesn't even matter as much as that tool to like connect us. And yet letting people speak for themselves and use their own language is sort of the ideal, right? Like if we had a world where everybody was able to say, like, I can speak for myself, and we hear them and we process that. And, Molly or Kyah, I don't know if you want to jump in, if you also have thoughts on this idea of how language is shifting or how people understand these issues. Feel free to jump in. I don't know if either of you have any comments on that.
I was going to add, I agree too, because I feel like it's interesting how language, especially in artistic situations, like you can't say that word, you can't say this, and I don't like to be one of those people, like, because I think it's always changing, and it's interesting. I have been on panels or something that say like artists of different abilities, and I'm like, I don't know why they can't say disability. Like, it's fascinating to me, and I feel like so many times with disability context, when you compare it to other minorities, like I prefer disabled artists. Like, would you say artist who is female or something? Like, it sounds a little weird. Like, I feel like it's so interesting, these parallels. Or would you put on a panel artists who are female or of differing genders? Or like, why wouldn't you just say like woman in music or something? And also just to add to that with media, like, I feel like so many times with shows or something, they'll say like, or I heard one show recently, they were like, I don't want to be that person in a wheelchair. It's like, would they say, I don't want to be that person of color? So like, that would sound so problematic, but I feel like so many times that slips by in media, like these kind of ableist phrases in a way. And I'm not trying to sound super negative, but for me, it's fascinating how I feel like disability has a lot of catching up to do in mainstream culture with what is allowable to say and so forth. And again, I'm not trying to get too hung up on certain terms or anything, but it's just fascinating to me. I feel like it reiterates flawed notions of what disability can be, or as an identity that someone wants or experience.
Yeah, and I guess what I just like to add, and I think this is one of the reasons, this is one of the reasons language is always hard in media and when talking about different demographics, is just that like disability is so incredibly diverse, like so incredible, and it's just, you can try your hardest, but that goes, it goes back to like everybody has their own voice and their own idea. Like even within like the autistic community, right, there's like actually autistic people nowadays, like the consensus is like, oh, I am autistic because it's the way that my brain is shaped and it's kind of who I am. Like that idea of like, if you wanted to cure me, you would have to kill me or like something, And the second part is that I think like people argue about why it matters a lot, like why does it matter the way that we speak about things and describe them in media and amongst our friends. And I would come back to this notion of like the micro very much so affects the macro in this case. And I think that I can elaborate on that for like 3 days, but that's really the idea, is that the way we talk about disability very much so influences the way that people think about disability. And so those terms do matter, but again, disabled people aren't a monolith, so it's hard to describe.
I love that. They're not a monolith, right? And Elizaveta, I love that you shared that process too, because I know as a teacher in the media space, and really in any space, if you're a teacher, the language of how you address people or how you include their experiences or reference their experiences changes. And I know for me, my philosophy has become, when I mess up, when I don't get it right for who I'm speaking to or speaking with, and just trying to create that culture of getting that feedback, and just like you did, right, of like hearing this person and do you go to the journal, do you go and replace it, and what is that process, and what can you do, but maybe this idea, I think that's becoming more prominent in media literacy, is that perfection is sort of like a useless goal, right? Perfection in how we represent or talk to people. And it's that process, and that iteration and getting feedback and being empathetic, and creating space for people in a way that's really sees them is kind of like the best that we can do, and sort of this goal that we want to aspire to. I know we're almost out of time, and I want to make sure we pause in case anybody's been too shy to put questions in the chat or to raise your hand. So just to take a minute and see if anybody in our audience here has anything specific they'd like to mention or any comments they would want to bring into the table. It's always hard to watch the chat and the hands at the same time. No amount of Zoom schooling would prepare me for that. Awesome. Well, we have just a few minutes. So what I would love is if anyone has any sort of additional thoughts. And maybe a question that I'll pose to everybody is, question. Helena, I don't know if I said that correctly, so please correct me. And
Yes.
thank you for being here. And what would you like to ask?
No problem. Helena, Elena, or Selena, never Jelena. That's like that because J in my language is silent. I'm psychologist and therapist by training. I'm almost 47. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. However, I worked with American, Canadian, global organizations, and I'm expert in literacy and numeracy for kids and let's say teenagers up to 12. So what I'm working on, and that might be interesting for all of you, is something called compassionate inquiry. Now the stress where the inquire like American English and British English and Canadian, etc. So that is very interesting in a sense of everything what you said today, because that is the approach, which is related to medication that might have consequences. And as the concept actually is focused on here and now, and how you actually relate to the client, to a child, to a teenager, to an adult who regresses to certain behaviors like maladaptive behaviors, etc. We appreciated the silence in a sense that the moment of silence when you connect. We do exercises about grounding, about actually using sign languages, etc. I like the way how a couple of you connected. And this is my invitation to you to look what they are doing, because they are also in the fields of literacy and numeracy, media, using media, however, establishing the standards in a sense to be sure actually that we understand that we are on the same page in a sense of understanding. So this is, I shared one document because I'm UNESCO alumni that is related to specific research in Switzerland, which actually invests a lot of funds, and it's kind of a important school. So look for that, and if you need some resources, I'm registered for this conference. Come back and I will be glad to further link. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that link as well. That's wonderful. I know I see Amanda in the chat mentioned that she had a question, and so I think we could take one more. I don't know, Amanda, if you want to unmute or if you want to type into the chat.
Sorry, I don't have video, but I'll unmute because I was trying to type it. Thank you all for sharing and giving me some really great insight to just think about. And I guess I have a question of how, so I've had, like, as an able-bodied person, sometimes I have trouble with saying disability, not to recognize that, but because of the deficient ways in which people react to that. As so as an educator, I'm trying to find language to help mitigate like the way in which people respond to things, which I know I can't do, but it's kind of like, what is the language I could do to help create spaces where people don't have that perception from a deficient base? And so in using the term, disability, what are some different ways that you all do to kind of counter people's responses? Everyone doesn't have that response, obviously, but there are a few that I noticed in just different contexts, and I feel like I'm trying to make people have build more awareness or more expansion. So are there any things that you all do to kind of help counter that or kind of mitigate that?
I actually have an answer for that. And it's really not so much as of an answer as much as it is some watching material that I actually think you would find really, really interesting. Let me get the link for you here, but basically Amy Mullins has an amazing TED Talk about just this topic. I'll put it in the chat. It's called the opportunity of adversity, and it's not really what you would think hearing about that, but she kind of covers this topic, and I think it's like really good viewing material. But I'll hand it over to Molly in case you, or Lisa, if you had anything to say.
I would add, I need to think about that question for a little bit. I think it's definitely been a process for me for just like saying disability more, identifying as disabled. And I think one turning point was another conversation with Judy Human, and she was like, I don't see disability anywhere in your bio. And that really, because I was making all this work about it, and that really stuck with me, that I think her philosophy is the more people see even the word, like the more it'll be, I don't say normalized, because I don't think disability needs to be normalized, but just more commonplace like language. And so that always stuck with me too, just in my own like artistic material, or just trying to use the term as much to not like shy away from it. That's more just my personal standpoint.
Wonderful. Well, we are officially out of time. I'm sorry, Elizaveta, I don't know if you have, a comment there. We could talk about this for much longer. And I'm so thankful for our panelists for being here today. You bring such different perspectives and different experiences and really wonderful contributions to this field. So thank you for making the time to be here. Thank you to everybody for joining us. And we will close this session, but you can look for the recording in the Zoom platform. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.